Charles Keeping was born into a working-class family in Lambeth, London in 1924, and when he left school at the age of 14 he took a correspondence course in art while working in a series of dead-end jobs. I can find no evidence of his early work, so the images I'm showing to accompany this account of his life before he began his career all come from much later, which I thought was a better option than a blank screen. In 1942, when Britain was at war with Germany, Keeping joined the Royal Navy as a wireless operator at the age of 18. In 1946 he took a job as a gas meter reader, but he continued to draw, and in 1949 he was offered a place at Regent Street Polytechnic to study illustration and lithography. There he met fellow student Renata Mayer, and in 1952 the couple married and went on to produce 4 children. When he graduated, Keeping started work as a freelance illustrator, but I found nothing to show until 1956, and from this point on the images shown are accurate reflections of the timescale of his career. It was in that year the Oxford University Press commissioned him to illustrate Rosemary Sutcliffe's historical children's novel The Silver Branch, which was published a year later. There were also more commercial commissions around this time too, such as this rather pedestrian colour cover for a diary's newsletter, and a collection of blockish monochromes for a large corporate food producer, masquerading as an educational book. In 1959 he illustrated another Roman novel for children by Rosemary Sutcliffe, The Lantern Bearers, following the same heavy stylistic approach as the first. And in the following year his career in illustration quickly gathered momentum with the publication of another 2 books. Other than its evocative cover, Flood Warning, a children's novel by Paul Berner, was another book created only in monochrome. But by this point the earlier stained glass look of his drawn style had undoubtedly become altogether more personal, flexible and expressive. Roads, How They Were Built, written by John Stuart Murphy, was the second book of that year, one in a series of educational books for school children looking at the evolution and development of various aspects of modern living and engineering. And despite the unpromising nature of the subject matter, Keeping's colour illustrations were a considerable distance from the usual prosaic fare created by others at this time for this kind of project. In 1961 another Rosemary Sutcliffe historical book, Dawn Wind, was published, and by now he was increasingly and successfully taking greater risks and delving into more overtly semi-abstracted territory with images of considerable distinctiveness, many of which were created as figure-based vignettes set against a page white, with an abundance of thinner line work to offset the heavier side of his technique. Patrick Kentigern Keenan, a lightly humorous Irish fantasy written by Molly Hunter, was published in 1963 with a collection of agreeably frivolous images from Keeping, and it was also released in the USA in the same year with the title The Smartest Man in Ireland. The Life of Our Lord by Henri Daniel Ropes followed in 1964. Ropes was a French religious scholar, but this publication was an English language reworking of the book, for which Keeping provided a series of illustrations which artfully combined what was by now his trademark more energetic line work with a collection of single flat colours applied selectively with considerable aesthetic appeal. All concentrated the viewer's attention on the relatively close-up studies of the various biblical characters, and in this instance background elements were almost totally absent. And his work for 1965's The Mark of the Horse Lord, yet another by Rosemary Sutcliffe, gave a clear indication of the evolution which had taken place in Keeping's style. The earlier, rather stiff and formal technique was by this point far more organic and able to evoke both character and movement with a rapidly emerging level of expressiveness. In 1966, Keeping published 2 picture books, both with horse-themed narratives. And far from the usual innocent animal themes expected in children's books, in both cases the horses had been mistreated. Shaun and the Cart Horse and its companion piece Black Dolly dealt with the unfortunate subject with great empathy, and in visual terms the colour images he created and the stylistic abandon he brought to all the pages clearly indicated a formidable creative talent. 1966 was also the year that his visualisation of Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front was published. This was undoubtedly one of those relatively infrequent occasions when the illustrator's graphic approach chimes perfectly with the tone and emotional power of the written narrative. This collection of harsh, semi-abstracted images was arguably one of his most resonant and emotionally charged achievements. This was obviously a particularly prolific time because 1966 also saw the publication of the medieval tale of King Horn, retold by Kevin Crossley Holland. Unsurprisingly, this was another good fit for Keeping's talents and his own fascination for historical subject matter. And in 1967, his own whimsical picture book, Charlie, Charlotte and the Golden Canary, was published, featuring a collection of remarkably intense kaleidoscopic colour illustrations. He kept the written narrative to a minimum while the pictures spoke with considerable eloquence in every scene depicted. I confess I was at a complete loss as to how he might have actually created colour work such as this, but a reliable source claims he was using a combination of sponge texturing and wax resist, along with the more conventional application of his vivid colours, which I can only imagine were watercolours or possibly coloured inks. But whatever his process, this was by anyone's standards a remarkably distinctive creative achievement. And by contrast, in the same year he returned to more sinister material for an edition of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, for which he produced a series of more than usually disturbing and brutally executed monochromes, which of course chimed well with the nature of the narrative and played to his strengths and facility for unsettling imagery. Tinker Tailor, an illustrated collection of folk songs, was published in 1968, and it was another book in which he explored the creative potential of the application of a range of clashing colours, with fragmented image construction, in which even what would have usually been the use of black line work to contain the shapes was itself created in various colours to produce a highly engrossing and unusual visual outcome. A year later he published another of his own evocative picture books featuring yet more dazzling and in this instance positively psychedelic examples of his expressive use of colour for Joseph's Yard. You might not have realised it from the hallucinatory quality of the images, but the narrative was set against a backdrop of the destruction of the old London terraces and communities, which were rapidly being replaced by more corporate structures. Not your average everyday subject for a children's book. The same year saw the publication of Margaret Miller's collection of British myths and legends, Knights, Beasts and Wonders, with illustrations by Keeping using a tastefully subdued limited colour palette, some of which were so abstracted they defied the reader to work out the actual content. But that was frequently part of the pleasure to be had from an extended study of Keeping's work, which always rewarded the viewer with an aesthetic experience usually more associated with fine art on a gallery wall. In 1970 he illustrated Leon Garfield and Edward Blishen's retelling of Greek myths, The God Beneath the Sea, with a series of monochromes combining a dazzling array of ink lines with added grey washes. And although this was a book for children and it won that year's Carnegie Medal, there were no concessions to the youth of the intended readership, as was frequently the case in Keeping's images and their content. The same writers and Keeping collaborated again for an equally successful retelling of the Greek myth The Golden Shadow, which again contained some fairly adult and violent material, which however disturbing was nonetheless all beautifully and dramatically rendered with his flawless graphic technique. And in the same year he travelled even deeper into the creation of menace and terror, with a collection of ghost stories by M.R. James published by the Folio Society, in this instance for adult readers. All his illustrations for this collection were rendered with remarkably controlled hatched inking, and the unsettling nature of these sombre images was manifestly an invaluable and highly memorable contribution to the book's success. Railway Passage, published in 1974, was another of Keeping's picture books which graphically lamented the passing of old London and the communities he grew up in, using a washed-out colour palette in the creation of his wistful evocations. And with similar, if more upbeat intent, in 1975 he published the book Cockney Ding Dong, which collected and illustrated the traditional songs of the family sing-alongs he had known from his childhood. Many of these had started life as songs performed in the late Victorian and Edwardian era in the many music halls around old London, and most were manically cheerful in nature, but whether deliberately or unintentionally, most of Keeping's images were rather melancholy. In 1976 he illustrated two more classics for the Folio Society. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto was another clear demonstration of the visual absorption he could create with a limited palette of just two well-chosen and equally well-balanced colours. And the images successfully invoke the Gothic darkness inherent in this tale. The same, of course, was just as true of that year's visualisation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, which also made great creative use of a similarly limited palette to dramatically evoke the unfortunate lives of the downtrodden masses of Paris in the 1830s. And in 1978, Keeping embarked on the colossal task of creating illustrations for the Folio Society's complete works of Charles Dickens. Alongside his work on other projects, he managed to illustrate 2 complete books a year for the next decade. They were all monochrome and rendered with fine, tightly controlled line work, which imbued his characters and environments with considerable Victorian plausibility and atmosphere. In 1982 he illustrated a lesser-known work by Rudyard Kipling, The Beginning of the Armadillos, and all the images were highly diverting and entertaining compositions in full colour, featuring the various animal characters in their natural environments. And as with so much of his work, although the characters and backgrounds were readily identifiable, they were nevertheless sophisticated, semi-abstracted distillations of reality rather than pure representation. In the 1980s, Keeping's ongoing successful relationship with the Oxford University Press led to the publication of a new, or at least new to the OUP, format, with a collection of black and white picture books, which almost but not entirely mimic the increasingly popular graphic novels aimed at teenagers. The first of these was a version of Alfred Noy's 1906 poem The Highwayman, published in 1981. And Keeping didn't shy away from the more disturbing and violent aspects of the rhyme simply because of the age of his intended readers. The next was an adaptation of the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, rewritten by Kevin Crossley Holland and published a year later. Like the Highwayman illustrations, these were very finely executed with a blend of spidery line work and added tonal effects including sprayed ink and heavier brushstroke calligraphic image making. And even if not actually violent or sexual in nature, they too were far from what many considered acceptable for the young. He returned to this series in 1985 with The Wedding Ghost, an original horror story by Leon Garfield, for which he received equal billing. And once more he used the finer end of his graphic expression to create disturbingly ethereal illustrations throughout. The last of this collection was his 1986 edition of Tennyson's Arthurian verse, The Lady of Shalott. These images were inevitably created using the same light touch in the line work and occasional sprayed ink he had become so enamoured of. And these immensely absorbing images brought a modern sensibility to this doom-laden romantic verse, while still retaining its elegiac mythical essence. In 1987, the not totally dissimilar tale of Sir Gawain, written by Neil Phillip, was published, with more monochrome vignettes which didn't shy away from the gorier aspects of medieval reality, and which were consequently more compelling than most of the more sanitised evocations of this historical period. It was also in that year that Charles Keeping's classic Tales of the Macabre was published, a collection of horror stories by various authors, And these ghastly narratives were of course well suited to his sombre graphic disposition and blend of purely decorative if unsettling elements, all of which was suitably dark in both execution and mood. And once seen, these images were guaranteed to haunt the reader's imagination. The same was true of 1988's joint publication of both Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula. For both books, the images he created were reproduced in monochrome only, but of course that was never to the detriment of Keeping's work, and both were very much character-based rather than scenic in nature, and he expertly manipulated the viewer's emotional responses to these classic Gothic narratives from pity to horror with great success. The last of his Dickens collection, Martin Chuzzlewit, was also published in the same year, and his final offering was his own Adam and Paradise Island, another wistful story of the changing landscape of London. But he died of a brain tumour in 1989 at the age of 65, and the book was published posthumously later that year. Charles Keeping was greatly admired by many for the undoubted aesthetic qualities of his work, and his refusal to toe the line in terms of our expectations of what is and isn't suitable for children. But conversely, that very creativity and lack of conformity led to his books only rarely selling in what might be considered large numbers. I only came upon his work when I started the channel, but as with some others who have been revealed to me late in life, I have to say I am awestruck by the depth of his creative and technical ability. And he may be gone, but I hope this tribute helps to ensure he is never forgotten.